What's up, everybody? My name is Demetri Kofinas, and you're listening to Hidden Forces, a podcast that inspires investors, entrepreneurs, and everyday citizens to challenge consensus narratives and to learn how to think critically about the systems of power shaping our world. My guest in this episode is financial historian, journalist, and author Edward Chancellor, who, for the last 20 years or so, has been perhaps best known for his book, Take the Hindmost, which is a fantastic history of the last 400 years of financial speculation. Yet, I would dare to say that he is set to break that streak with the publication of his latest book, The Price of Time, which is an absolutely brilliant philosophical exploration of interest and its essential role in valuing and directing the allocation of capital, labor, and resources in the economy over time. My oft-used description of interest rates on this podcast and elsewhere as the price of money, while useful, fails to capture their temporal dimension, the role they play, in other words, in expanding the continuum of economic activity, cooperation, investment, and consumption beyond the immediate grasp of the present moment. The ability to accumulate capital in the form of money enables us to operate outside of entropy's constraints. We aren't limited, in other words, by the decomposition or decay of a sack of barley, a barrel of oil, or a concrete building. But in order to value that capital through both time and space, we need something more, and that something is interest. It's the price you pay to borrow money, or the cost you charge to lend it over time. Over the last 2 decades, the price of time has plummeted to levels never before seen in human history, and with it have arrived a multiplicity of asset price bubbles, a reduction in productivity growth, rising wealth and income inequality, a discouragement of savings, a growth in supply chains, and an excessive amount of risk-taking, encouraged by the financial repression of policymakers and the acrobatics of yield-starved investors who have ventured further out along the risk curve in search of a better return. In this excellent and timely conversation, you're going to learn about the history of interest, its historical role in promoting human cooperation, economic activity, and advancement. You're also going to learn about how interest is priced, where it comes from, and the difference between the so-called natural rate of interest and what central banks have claimed as their policy lever to control the scale, scope, and distribution of capital in society. In the second hour of our conversation, which is available to premium subscribers only, Edward and I apply the framework that we develop in the first part of the episode to help us understand where we find ourselves today, whether or not central banks and governments can indeed use their policy tools to fix the very problems that those tools have helped to create, what some of those solutions and the path forward could look like, and what all of this means for you and your portfolio. Hidden Forces is listener supported. I don't rely on advertisers or commercial sponsors. So if you want access to the second hour of today's conversation, as well as the transcripts and intelligence reports, which include my takeaways from every episode, as well as my thoughts on what comes next, head over to hiddenforces.io, select the episode that you're interested in, and click on the premium extras, where you can then sign up to one of our premium content tiers. And with that, please enjoy this wonderfully informative, important, and timely conversation with my guest, Edward Chancellor. Edward Chancellor, welcome to Hidden Forces.
Thank you for having me.
The pleasure is all mine, Edward. I was catching you up on the first time you and I ever met, which I knew, and the second time actually, which I don't think you remember either times, which is not surprising. You meet so many people, but I was telling my listeners, and I'm going to share this anyway, because I always like to share when I have a chance to have a guest on the podcast whose work I'm very familiar with, or whose work I'm familiar with rather from a much younger age. And so I met you and Jim Grant together at the same event back in early 2011. And it was a conversation at, I think, the Harvard Club. It was some place on the Upper West Side between the 60s and the 70s. And it was you, it was Jim Grant, and it was Steinhardt. And the conversation was about the gold standard. And of course, we all know where Jim falls there. Steinhardt was to the right, and you were in the middle. And as I said, one of the comments that you had made that made me laugh quite a bit, and that I've told people the story a number of times because I thought it was so funny. You said that you weren't an enemy of gold, that you found it to be a rather sympathetic metal. And that kind of, I think, captured your middle of the road position on the subject at the time. So I don't know if we'll have a chance to talk about gold. Maybe we will.
Yeah, I think we should towards the end, at least.
Great. Okay. So, but before we talk about any of this, you have written this really phenomenal book. As I've told listeners in the introduction, you've been, I think, best known the last 20 years for Take the Hindmost, which is a 400-year history of financial speculation. And I think that record may get broken with this book because this book really is special. It's a beautiful philosophical exploration of a subject that is, I think, everyone knows or thinks they know what an interest rate is or has heard of interest rates. But no one thinks about interest rates as deeply as you have in this book. So I'm so excited to get into that. Before we do any of that, I'm curious to know a little bit about you. How did you get interested in financial history? And did it begin with an interest in financial journalism and history? How did that all come together?
Well, I was a historian as an undergraduate, and then I did a postgraduate degree at Oxford and decided I didn't want to become an academic, so went into the City of London. And then I worked in investment banking for Lazard Brothers, what Americans know as Lazard Frères. And I didn't like investment banking at all. But as I went into the city, one started to hear stories about the tulip mania and the railway mania and these great speculative bubbles. So I quit my job after a couple of years and thought I'd write a book on the subject. So that's sort of how I got into it. And then I suppose over the last 20 years, I've always been adapting my interests, historical and current, to what I thought were the big issues of the day in the financial world. So if you think about it, in the 1990s, as I was writing Take the Hindmost, we had the great dot-com bubble going on, and that was sort of background for that project. Then a lesser-known project I did after the dot-com bust was a report on the credit boom, which was commissioned by a London hedge fund manager called Chris Binodi. And we published that as a sort of very limited release in 2005. And that was called Crunch Time for Credit. And then we had the financial crisis. And as you know, interest rates were taken down to zero, and sort of the world started looking pretty strange, the financial world, and then the real world also. And I was working in Boston at the time for the investment firm GMO in the asset allocation group. And it seemed to me that we didn't really understand interest and interest rates in the asset allocation group. We were trying to predict the direction of bonds, and we weren't doing a very good job. I went to see Jim Grant in New York around that time, sort of 2010. I said, Jim, are there any good books on interest? And Jim cited a work by sort of 1960s academic Joseph Conall called An Introduction to Interest. But as he said, he didn't find it very useful. And then I remember Jim saying, I've been predicting interest rates for 25 years. And I said, you haven't been doing a very good job at it, have you, Jim? At which point he emitted an expletive, which I won't repeat now. So that sort of question of working out what interest does, where interest rates are going, what these ultra low interest rates were doing in the world and the period over the global financial crisis, and the fact that there didn't seem to be anything readily accessible on the subject. There is, as you know, the great magisterial work, The History of Interest Rates by Sidney Homer and Dick Siller. But that book, I mean, and I reference that a lot in this current book, but that book is deliberately agnostic on what actually interest rates do. It gives you the story of how interest rates have moved, but it stands back from the complex theoretical aspects of the story, which I I felt I had to get it into, but try and get into a way that I didn't get completely lost in the weeds.
Fascinating. So I have one more question about your decision to write about financial history before we move to the subject of the book, because I've always found it to be so interesting and fascinating. And I've come to the view that the reason for that is because of its complexity, the sort of puzzle that you're constantly trying to figure out, and also the preponderance of interesting characters. Finance has so many interesting personalities. And I'm curious what has attracted you to this field and what's made you continuously want to go back to the well and write more about it.
Well, I mean, I'd say two things. First of all, I think my natural bent is as an historian, that I feel comfortable in the past. And because I feel comfortable there, it's probably the area of finance where I can most easily make some contribution. So that's one point. The other is, as I've spent more time in the field of financial history, is one realizes this tremendous cyclicality or regularity of events. As again, going back to Jim Grant, perhaps we'll spend most of our time talking about Jim today, but as Jim says, how come mankind is always stepping on the same rake? We repeat the errors of the past, and if we know how those errors were created, we are less likely to repeat them. And I think, sort of blowing my own trumpet, but I would say that over the last 25 years, the historians were the ones who were pretty sure the dot-com bubble was a bubble and that it was going to burst. And it was the historians largely who were pretty sure that the credit boom of the early 2000s, which also incorporated a number of bubbles, was a train wreck waiting to happen. And so I think it gives you an edge, knowing the errors of the past and being able to identify similarities to the present. There are, as you know, timing issues. The historians, tend to be very early. And if you're actually managing money, particularly if you're running a short book, that earliness can knock you out of business. And even if you're just long, these things can take. I mean, Jeremy Grantham at GMO, Jeremy sees himself as a financial historian, at least from the sort of data perspective. And GMO, which he was running in the late 1990s, and he was running the asset allocation department, they had massive outflows because the firm under Jeremy was refusing to participate in the bubble. So there are obviously problems looking at finance from a purely, or investment from a purely historical perspective. But I think if you don't look at finance, to history, you can run into even deeper problems.
No, I couldn't agree more. So I wonder then, why is it that history seems to be so underrepresented in the economics establishment? I mean, I believe that there was only one course, and it wasn't even a required course in my economics bachelor program on history, on the history of economic thought. And it wasn't strongly advertised. And like I said, it wasn't necessary to complete the degree. What were necessary were courses on theoretical economics using a lot of the models borrowed from physics. So why do you think that is? Why have we abandoned history?
Well, I think you just said it. What happened, I think, let's say in the post-war period, is economics went down this sort of pseudo-scientific progression and became heavily subject to sort of mathematical models. And the mathematicians pushed everyone else out. You said there was a course in economic theory on your undergraduate degree, but there's also economic history. Now, as far as I understand, both the history of economic thought and economic history have both been sort of pushed away. And I think that's because modern economics has a sort of physics envy. In fact, there's a book I keep meaning to read by Philip Morosky, which is about how in the late 19th century, the economics started to go down this sort of physics route. And I think once you conceive of your subject as a science rather than a social science, then you think that all the intellectual problems have been solved and they don't need to be re-examined. And because they don't need to be re-examined, you don't need to know where you're coming from. Whereas actually, because I was trained as a historian, I actually quite enjoy re-examining the issues that the economists consider to have been settled. And then lo and behold, you find that they're ignoring pretty interesting stuff.
Do you think that this has to do with the attraction of certainty, that economic models provide us with the illusion of greater certainty, and that the more history you read, the more uncertain you feel about anything, and that certainty is something that policymakers have and need in abundance? And because we live in an increasingly technocratic society, that models that tell us how the economy works and what happens when we change variable X or Y, and so that this is actually more relevant and important for the people that are actually making economic policy than history, which just mucks things up. It just makes things too complicated.
Well, I mean, history is a one-off, whereas the models purport to represent the world in which you can put some inputs in and get some, as you say, some certain outputs out. Now, my view is that we live in a complex world and that it's pretty difficult to model. When I was doing the work on the credit boom back in 2003 to late 2004, it was then that I came across the work of Hyman Minsky. And I also started to read more about the Austrian economist Friedrich Hayek and his thoughts on the 1920s credit boom. And a year or so later, after we published this report, I was in New York and I had lunch with an old Wall Street economist called Al Vojniloa. I don't know if he was sort of alongside Henry Kaufman at Salomon Brothers. Vojniloa was at First Boston and then, I suppose, Credit Suisse First Boston. The two of them were the best known Wall Street economists of the 1970s. Anyway, I said to Vojniloa, we're talking about Minsky, whom he'd known. And I said, well, why do people not write about Minsky nowadays? And Vojniloa said, he's difficult to model. And then he said, and we talked about Hayek, and he said the same thing about Hayek, that Hayek was difficult to model. Now, Hayek has a particular view of the complexity of social organisms. Now, then go into the post-crisis period. The economist who I cite a lot in my book is Claudio Borio at the Bank for International Settlements. Now, Claudio Borio, along with his former boss, Bill White, who was chief economist at the Bank for International Settlements until, I think, 2008, Borio and White presentation to the Federal Reserve, I think in 2003, in which they said, the ship was sailing towards the rocks. And they were right. You can go back and read their paper. You can go back and read even earlier paper by Borio, 2002, in which he pointed out that if you had strong credit growth and strong real estate markets or bubbling real estate markets, these were more likely than not to end in, so to speak, high-cost recessions. No one paid attention to Borio, but he and Bill White probably are of sort of well-known establishment economists, probably have the best claim to have predicted the global financial crisis. So a few years after the financial crisis, I was at dinner and there was an Italian economist, lady economist there, who'd worked for the ECB and was now at London Business School. She was Italian. So I said, I'm a great fan of Claudio Borio. And she says, oh, Borio, nobody pays attention to Borio. You cannot model Borio. Well, I mean, in other words, you cannot model a person who actually has a strong track record of making accurate predictions about what is going on in the financial world. Now, if you remember, Milton Friedman, one of his famous comments about economics was it didn't matter whether the inputs or the assumptions of an economic model were realistic, providing the outputs, the forecasts were accurate. But here we have a world in which the economists have unrealistic inputs and woefully inaccurate forecasts.
I think Jim, now I'm going to quote Jim, but I think Jim has this saying, well, it's all well and good in practice, but what's the theory? And yeah, I think I agree. So I want to mention to listeners that both Claudio Borio and William White have been on the podcast before. So I strongly suggest that you guys go back and listen to them. I think I don't know where else you can find a conversation with Claudio Borio on a podcast. We might have been the only ones, and it was for quite an extended period of time. So let's actually pivot now to a conversation about your book, Edward. And let's just kind of go at the very top. What is interest? I mean, this is what the book's about. And like I said, it's a philosophical exploration. So let's take some time to understand what it is. How would you define it?
Well, my definition of interest is in the title of the book, The Price of Time, that if one was going to give a sort of slightly wordier definition of interest, it is the charge for the use of capital over a period of time. But the question of time is the essence of interest. So, for instance, if I were to lend you $100 and ask for it immediately back, it would be unseemly of me to charge interest on it because you couldn't have done anything with it. So another definition for interest is the charge for the use, is the fact that the other person has a use of your capital for a given period of time. But as I go on and we can talk about it, one can define, and people have defined interest in a variety of different ways, which reflect the different functions that interest has. And we can get into that in more detail later because I elaborate on about sort of roughly half a dozen of those different, if you will, sort of sub-definitions of interest.
Yes, no, I would like to. Before we do that, though, it's interesting what you said about that it would be rather unseemly to lend me $100 and expect it right back and charge me interest for it, which captures, I think, a moral dimension that now I'm going to tie this back to an episode that I did with Nicholas Christakis. The episode was about the moral origin, the biological origins of morality. And one of the things that I thought about in the course of reading this book was, what are the origins of interest, and how much of it is a technological innovation of mankind, and how much of it is just innately biological? In other words, the expectation naturally that you should get something more for something that you don't use today if you were to defer consumption of that good or use of that good into the future.
I think what you're referring to is what's known as the fructification the theory of interest, the theory that something gives fruit over time. And this drives the Marxists mad, but we'll leave that aside for the time being. And if we go back, and as I mentioned in the book, we find interest existing in these sort of earliest moments of recorded human history in Mesopotamia, at least as far back as the 3rd millennium BC. And if one looks at the etymology of interest in the ancient languages, such as Assyrian or Egyptian or ancient Greek or in Latin, there's always this allusion to animals, to calves, to lambs, to cattle, to some young product of livestock. And so we can surmise that the earliest lending was most likely to do with either grain sowing in the fields for barley or wheat, or they were livestock loans. And as I mentioned, I got this from Homer and Scylla. Even in the 19th century, American farmers were borrowing cattle and paying interest in terms, with calves. So that the agricultural loan is probably the earliest instance of lending at interest, and providing the charge is not too high, it's not unfair that a farmer should repay more than he has lent out, given that the livestock has had some offspring or that the corn has multiplied in the field.
Interesting. So it's kind of like the goose that lays the golden eggs. You can eat the goose, but it comes at the cost of some undefinable quantity of golden eggs or we can estimate it based on the lifespan of the geese, etc. Right? I mean,
Yes.
effectively that livestock produce more livestock, that grain produces more grain.
Exactly. And then even as you sort of talk about the fact that you could eat the goose if you chose to, or wait for it to lay some golden eggs, there is this other function that interest serves, which is an inducement to save. In other words, not to consume all your grain this year, but to lend it out and then get more back at some stage in the future. So that's probably another pretty early and in a way fairly obvious function of interest. And in the 19th century, as English economists defined interest as a reward for abstinence. So that's the other function it serves.
So when I started to learn about economics, the general idea was that money came first and credit and loans and interest came second. But I think in recent years, we've discovered that isn't actually true or isn't likely true. What do we know about the origins of interest in terms of their timeline of money and money's creation? How did that all come together?
So the point you make about there is this idea that the original societies were barter societies, and then money came to replace barter. When I was doing the work on credit, I was actually just having sort of thought experiments on my own about how credit originated, and it seemed to me that you had to have the sort of Credit Act first, and then I hadn't read this anywhere, but then David Graeber, who was a British sort of anthropologist, economist, who died a few years back, wrote a book called Debt, the First 10,000 Years, which came out, I don't know, around 2009, 10, thereabouts. And Graeber cites that notion that credit preceded money. Now, if you're going to have credit, except in the modern age, you're going to have interest with the credit, because I'm not going to lend you, my stuff and give it to you and without any charging any interest. Not least, for two reasons. One is, and this is another definition of interest, that the word interesse in Latin is actually sort of was a legal term for actually a loss. So that if I lend you something of mine, which I could use profitably, like say a cow, I actually suffer a loss of interest. The other reason I'm not going to give you some money for a long period of time for no interest is that there is a danger that you will abscond or go bankrupt, and in which case I need some compensation for the risk I'm taking. So that leads one on to the other definition of interest being the price of risk, or as an Italian economist in the 18th century called it, the price of anxiety. So those are sort of early reasons. But I'm now slightly lost the thread. Well, will you remind me what your question was?
I think my question was about the origins of interest, and if the loan came before money. Yeah, there was the loan.
I think so. That in interest, I say, goes back to, let's say, 3rd millennium BC. The first coins are only struck in the 7th century BC. So there's sort of a couple of centuries of lending, although admittedly, the Mesopotamians are lending silver ingots. So you could say that is a sort of monetary form, if you want.
Although you could imagine earlier forms of interest. For example, if I'm a Pacific Islander and I lend you my spear to go fishing and you come back and you split the fish with me, that's a loan and it bears interest in the form of the
that
fish.
Was almost exactly. I think that is exactly the thought experiment I had, just sort of, lying in bed one morning. I was thinking exactly along those lines or you could have a baker who lends the fisherman some bread, and the fisherman goes fishing and brings back and gives them a reward somewhat greater than he actually received.
Exactly. And I think that's useful. I mean, in keeping with the philosophical thinking around what it is. So actually, in keeping with that thinking, let's talk a little bit more about the temporal dimensions of interest, because I think this is also very fascinating and useful for people to think about. I think of it, again, this is, of course, in keeping with the notions of time. It's like the fourth dimension, insofar as it expands the space of productivity of an economy beyond simply the constraints of the moment and, in some sense, the entropic constraints of the universe. In other words, if we could not share or collaborate over time, but only space, we would be constrained by the decay and decomposition of the things that we hold in possession today. So a sack of barley, a barrel of oil, even the concrete on a building, it decays over time. And so the ability to grapple with these intangible notions of value over not just space, but time as well, expands the universe of productivity for human society and cooperation. Talk to me a little bit about that. I mean, how do you think about that? And how important is that in terms of truly transforming by leaps and bounds the productivity and technological innovation of humankind?
Yeah, and I think you make a very important point there. I'm not sure if I make it quite so well myself in my book. But one thing we see, one criticism of interest, right from the early days, is that it has a tendency to compound. And as debt compounds, everything else being equal, it becomes less bearable. And there is this case I cite of two warring Mesopotamian kingdoms in which one makes a claim for unpaid rent, in effect, going back a few decades, and that the amount of barley they're claiming is unfathomably large. And then people writing about interest. In the 18th century, a fellow called Price calculated, what would happen with sort of a gold coin at the time of the birth of Jesus Christ, how if it compounded at, the conventional rate, I don't know, 2 or 3% from that date, how much it would be, how big the amount of gold would be by the 18th century. And it was 2.5 times the size of the Earth. And this calculation is often cited in critiques of interest. So Karl Marx, for instance, cites Price's calculation, and the French anarchist Proudhon, who I mentioned, he also cites the calculation. And in a way, dare I say it, Thomas Piketty is belonging to the same school when he says that, when the interest rate is above the growth rate, you get galloping inequality. But what you're suggesting is what these people tend to be overlooking, which is if the loan is productive, you increase the size of the pie, and therefore you don't get an ever-growing debt burden. And there's another aspect, which Piketty definitely overlooks, is that, like it or not, we consume our interest, our rents, and therefore the pot of gold doesn't actually compound to twice the size of the Earth, because we need something to live off.
Yes, and the other thing is that there's a social contract here. No one signed it, but we all sort of understand it intuitively, and it relies on not just interest, but the laws to ensure that the property that you are rightfully owed will be delivered to you. And we have all of these sets of norms and contracts that allow us to be increasingly productive. But we also have, and this is to bring it back to this, some either biological foundation to these conversations, or simply the preponderance of morality and its importance, which is that people are okay with the idea that some amount of work that you've done today, you can be owed that into the future. by a series of contracts, loans, interest, etc. But there comes a point when people feel that there's a fundamental level of unfairness between the amount of income that can be generated from capital versus the amount of income that can be generated from labor. And I think, that's I'll put a pin in that because I think it's something that we definitely want to explore because it leads directly to a conversation about the wealth and income gap and what role the suppression of interest rates have played in that relationship. But before we do, I want to just build a bit. I want to strengthen this foundation a bit more and bring it back to interest rates specifically. So you had mentioned, I don't know if this is one of the things that you mentioned early on in the conversation, or if we even got into it, I don't know that we did, but how are interest rates determined? How would you explain to listeners the way in which we decide what an interest rate is or should be? And that can lead us eventually to a conversation, obviously, about who determines interest rates. Is it the market? Is it an emergent phenomenon of a capitalist free market economy? Or do there need to be policymakers who set it, which is what I think the vast majority of people think?
Well, we know that don't need when you're thinking policymakers at central banks, it can't be
the risk-free rate, right? Yeah,
they haven't been around for very long in the general. Yeah. So if we've got 5 millennia and they've been around for roughly 250 years, I mean that's what 5% or thereabouts. It's sort of they hardly figure in the long history of interest, so it can't be them. And there are, as I say, sort of number of competing interest theories, but if we'd simplify things, we could say one of them is the productivity theory of interest, which is that, frankly, what is your return? What's your potential return from the use of capital? And so that is going to, to bound what the interest, what at least what a sort of a merchant or entrepreneur is going to pay on a loan. And I mentioned Adam Smith had a sort of rough rule of thumb. I think David Ricardo, likewise, which, Smith thought that interest was just half the rate of return on capital. I mean, there's no sort of particular evidence for it, but he thought that was your rentier, so to speak, sharing the profits of capital. On the other side, there's an aspect of interest which we haven't discussed so far, which is really referred to as the impatience theory of interest, or also known as the time preference theory of interest, which is how eager, what are you willing to pay for something today, to pay to enjoy something today, say a consumption loan rather than a production loan, and how much are you willing to pay back in order to have, how much more are you willing to pay back in future in order to have enjoyed your pint of beer today? And so the time preference theory suggests that interest originates within the individual and then is sort of aggregated at the national level, and then you can, if the world is trading, as the world is one, then you can make it even bigger and talk about a sort of global rate of interest. Then, so those are two ideas, and it's two perhaps ideas about interest that don't really depend on any sort of authority. But we also see, again, go back into the ancient world, that interest rates seem to follow particular paths in different civilizations, and sometimes that's the dictate of the authority. So the Mesopotamians, for instance, charged 20% on silver loans, Norm, and 33.3% on barley loans. And that reflects, as I mentioned in the book, that it actually reflects their numeric systems. And then the Greeks charged 10%, but they used a decimal system, and the Romans charged 1/12, or was it 8.25% or thereabouts. So you have these different traditions of interest in different civilizations. So there does seem to be some link between the interest rate and the sort of tradition of that society. And actually, to go back to the more recent period, the work that Claudio Borio and his colleagues at the BIS have done is they showed that each monetary regime, the gold standard, gold exchange standard, Bretton Woods, post-Bretton Woods, whatever you want to call it, dollar standard, they've all tended to have different levels of interest. And then you're getting more, more into the monetary area. And so someone like Keynes and his followers sort of believe that interest is a sort of variable that can be set by the central banks, that it's a purely monetary phenomenon. And lying behind that, as far as I can see, is if it's purely monetary phenomenon, it's sort of not really necessary. And I suppose there's not buying completely into that notion. But as I say at the outset, I'm prepared to take quite a sort of Catholic view of the different origins of interest. And I cite Irving Fisher, the great American economist, who wrote an excellent book called The Theory of Interest, in which Fisher says, there are all these competing ideas about interest, but if you look at them, they're not, and people fought over them with violently. Like they're like, the economists used to fight about interest in the way that sort of, Christians used to fight over their various dogmas. But as Fisher says, they're not actually all mutually exclusive. You can sort of bring productivity theory and, for instance, you can bring the productivity theory of interest and the time preference theory of interest together. They can fold together, and you don't have to hold one view exclusive of another.
Mm. Yeah, I've always been most convinced by the view that interest is something that arises naturally. And I've always used the term price of money, though I find your term price of value or price of time more expansive. But regardless, I think that it's something that arises naturally. And the reason why central banks have so much power over interest rates, at least what we consider to be the risk-free rate or the rate set by the policymakers, is because they have so much power over our money. And that has always seemed kind of the most obvious thing to me. There are to your point, there are so many different types of interest rates, and that also creates some confusion, I think, for listeners whenever I talk about interest rates, and I use that term so interchangeably with the Fed funds rate, which I really shouldn't.
Yes, there are an infinite variety of interests. They vary both on the credit spectrum and on the sort of spectrum of time. And within that, you can have, as I say, sort of infinite numbers. But I think you can still use the term interest rate as a shorthand in the same way that we talk about sort of consumer price index or whatever. It's a bit of a cheat, but there is a sort of arbitrage between all the very different rates of interest. And so that, for instance, you could, if you were a hedge fund guy, you could, borrow from your prime broker and gear up and buy some high yield bonds or whatever, or some foreign currency bonds, whatever. And so you're arbitraging these different rates of interest. And therefore there is a collective universe of rates.
What are the origins? I'm curious about this. It's not something you really go into in the book, but just given the topic and given how much you've read in your life, I wouldn't be surprised if you have a pretty good, readily available answer, which is, what are the origins of central bank interest rate targeting? Because in my attempts to understand this, interest rate targeting, as far as I've been able to understand, was not part and parcel of the origins of central banking. That the primary role of central banks was to help unblock markets during periods of illiquidity or during periods of financial crises. The illiquidity periods, of course, there was always periods of seasonal illiquidity, which coincide with some of the frequency of financial panics around the fall. But when did they get into this practice of targeting rates? And then when did they get to this practice of stating their targets and then eventually providing additional guidance to let market participants know where those rates will be, to where we are today, this crazy mess, where we're all trying to figure out what Jay Powell meant with his latest press conference. And when we misinterpret what he meant, then they have to start sending out their messengers to start saying this and that. We have really gotten to a wild place in this whole sort of process of interest rate making at the central bank level.
So life was a bit simpler under the gold standard, because the job of the central bank under gold standard was just to ensure the solvency of the bank and the convertibility of its notes into gold specie. And you didn't need to hire a large number of economists or to make forward guidance or predict where interest rates were going, because you didn't know. And in the Bank of England in the 19th century, they didn't even have commercial bankers on the court of Bank of England. That was considered a sort of potential conflict of interest. We're pretty sort of simple, merchants of the City of London, and interest rates moved according to the bullion flow. Then the end of the First World War gold standard, classical gold standard, is interrupted, and you get a sort of this hybrid model of what is technically called the gold exchange standard. As you know, a lot of historians fail to make a proper distinction between the gold standard pre-1914 and the monetary arrangements of the 1920s, which were much more expansionary, or what do they call it, elastic. And it was at that time because at this time central bank reserves could be both gold and US or sterling bonds, government bonds. You had the capacity to increase the reserves, and then you had the capacity to start manipulating interest rates. So I don't think they would have talked about targeting interest rates there, but you see open market, the Fed in its first 10 years or 10, 15 years conducting open market operations to bring the Fed funds rate down, or I think it was really the New York Fed rate that was the key rate at the time. Then if you go more recently, I don't think the Fed was targeting interest rates. They were, under Volcker, they were targeting money supply growth in order to bring down inflation. And as Volcker said, he didn't care how high interest rates went. It was only...
How's that for forward guidance?
I know. And Volcker got a lot of grief at the time, even though he did the job. And then it was only in the early 1990s that the Fed shifted towards targeting interest. And I think the problem with targeting interest specifically is there are people who gain and people who lose from every movement in interest. And so once you've targeted the interest rates, the decisions become extremely political. Mm-hmm. And that was really the case, as I mentioned, in Britain in the 1920s, when Britain was trying to get back on the gold standard, and that required raising the price of sterling on the foreign exchange, and it required a sort of deflationary policy, and the movements in the interest rates ordered by the Bank of England became hyper-political. And this is the point at which Keynes himself, the most political of economists, becomes both an enemy of the gold standard, but also a sort of arch enemy of tight money. And ever since that date, really, the sort of Keynes and his followers have always preferred the sort of easy money route, I'd say.
So, Edward, I'm going to move the second hour of this conversation onto the premium feed, and I want to give listeners an idea of where I want to focus our conversation next. What I wanted to do in this first part was to give people a taste of the philosophical contours of the conversation in order to help build a foundation for the second part, which is going to be much more practical insofar as I want to look at the world that we find ourselves in today. So one of those things that I think is worth contemplating is the mess of things that have resulted from all of this active and increasingly active intervention on the part of central banks and policymakers in financial markets, and specifically in messing with the quantities of money and the price of interest. And this has many unintended consequences. Again, to quote Jim Grant, who I should also say for anyone who's not remotely familiar with hidden forces, Jim has been on the podcast, I think 3 times thus far. And so Jim, years ago, talked about how if he was appointed chairman of the Fed, the first thing he would do, I think the second thing he would do would be to resign. But I think the first thing that he said he would do would be to open up an office of a department of unintended consequences. I'm probably misquoting him a little bit, but that I do remember. And there are so many unintended consequences that arise from Fed policy. And this, of course, brings us back to this issue, this problem of certainty versus uncertainty. The more you learn, the less certain you are about anything. But in order to set policy, you need to be pretty certain. And you need to sound certain because you need to convince markets, because this is the paradigm that we live in. So this is something I want to talk about. I also want to talk about China and Chinese industrialization, and compare perhaps the industrialization of the Chinese economy post 1990. So say between 1990 and 2020 with the industrialization of America during the second great industrialization post-Civil War, say from 1870 to 1900. Because both of those periods experienced enormous booms in credit, but the former was on a gold standard. And when I say gold standard, you had the Bank of England, which was, I think, really kind of set global interest rates at the time. You can correct me. And of course, we had the National Banking Act in the United States, but credit was still much more constrained in the United States than it was in China. And still, you saw railway booms. Bankers had to play a role in consolidating companies and preventing destructive levels of competition in the US. So you had a different set of problems. But in China, the amount of credit that's been extended is enormous. So I want to consider that. Perhaps also what the Japanese economy can tell us about where the future is going. And of course, where are things going for us? What path are we on in the United States? What path are the Europeans on? And are we going to end up seeing more of stuff like MMT, So that could be another avenue of conversation, gold as well. There's so much to talk about, Edward. For anyone who is new to the program, Hidden Forces is listener supported. We don't accept advertisers or commercial sponsors. The entire show is funded from top to bottom by listeners like you. If you want access to the second hour of today's conversation with Edward, as well as the episode transcripts and intelligence reports, head over to hiddenforces.io and check out our episode library, where you can also become a premium subscriber today. Edward, stick around. We're going to move the rest of our conversation onto the premium feed. For more information about this week's episode, or if you want easy access to related programming, visit our website at hiddenforces.io and subscribe to our free email list. If you want access to full episodes, transcripts, and intelligence reports, which include additional notes, resources, links, and other material that will help you get the most out of each and every episode, check out our premium subscription, available through the Hidden Forces website at hiddenforces.io. Today's episode was produced by me and edited by Stylianos Nicolaou. For more episodes, you can check out our website at hiddenforces.io. Join the conversation at Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Hidden Forces Pod, or send me an email at dk@hiddenforces.io. As always, thanks for listening. We'll see you next week.